to Agenda 21 Radio, and we have Simone pictured there. It's a great picture. Simone, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine. It's welcome aboard.
Right. I'm not sure what was going on there. I went on 3 or 4 times and it finally clicked in on the last one. So here we are.
Stranger than strange, right?
I've had a lot of technology issues and actually had my YouTube stations been interfered with lately as I'm starting to repost new things. I got a little more aggressive on my content over the last few months. So I got my first strike on YouTube. So please go over to Rumble if anybody's watching me on YouTube at Lost in Translation Show. One word.
Yeah. Well, I'm banned. It looks like indefinitely till 2029.
I imagine that's been going on.
It's Mary Nichols at the California Air Resources Board hates my guts, and she's best friends with everybody over at Google. So I'm doomed from Google. That's all right. Yeah, we have other ways to get our message out. But anyway, we're talking about Kamala Harris. And the last time we were here, we had quite a series developing into the second show. We ran out of time. We had a lot of stuff that was developing about some of the people that you were identifying, Joe Biden and the Harris family, or at least Kamala's side of the family, very intimately involved in slavery. And a lot of people didn't know that.
Correct. That's one of our topics. Her family founded Brownsville, Jamaica, which is a slave colony. And literally the slavery was made illegal by the British Parliament in 1836, but her family actually kept their slaves until the 1870s. Of course, the people were on an island, so even if they were free, they weren't allowed to get any housing, vote, or get a job. So they were actually literally just trapped on the plantation. But Joe Biden's family was also a founding member of the transatlantic slave trade back in the 1300s under the Royal African Company. That was made illegal by the British Parliament, again, a few hundred years later. And they reorganized under the British East and West India Company. And we're going to find some ties that I had not expected. For one, the founding member in the Biden family and Joe Biden's mother's name is Finnegan. Now, Finnegan is also a popular name in the slave colony of Jamaica. And what people don't understand about the slave industry, still today, 25% of the population of India lives in a slave system where they're literally, basically, they're not allowed to be educated. They have no rights. They're basically the working class that's trapped in that system. They're not allowed to marry. For instance, if a woman did want to marry up in that system, most likely the women in that house who were in the higher class would light her on fire in the kitchen or something crazy like that. So slavery is still an established practice in India. So it's not a big stretch to understand that the Irish and the Scottish, when their activities became illegal in the British Empire, they went down to, which was still part of the British Empire, India, and they had slave colonies there. So it was just interesting for me to find out that Kamala Harris also claims her family lineage is a Finnegan. Now, Finnegan is the family name of Joe Biden's mother's family, who were co-founders of the transatlantic slave trade.
Wow.
So, if you really start, but that's a lie. I do believe the Finnegans, there probably were children of the other Finnegan slave traders who were part, interracial people, because they had been trading slaves down in Jamaica for a long time. But apparently, according to I don't know if anyone's seen the Candace Owens and Judge Joe Brown documentaries that they've been doing for the last 2 weeks. And I mean, this just has some incredible stuff. They challenged all the stuff that Donald Harris, Kamala's father, wrote in his Reflections of a Jamaican Father essay that was published years ago about who his mother was and who his family was. And Kamala Harris has also been proven to be repeatedly lying in her own biography book.
Right.
And one would ask, we understand that her mother's family, both her parents were avid communists. This is one of my questions. why were we importing communist teachers into the United States during the 1960s? This is just a question that's kind of out there, but both of her parents were involved in political demonstrations and were avid communists. Her mother was also involved in MK Ultra. And if anyone understands what MK Ultra is, it's the mind control projects brought over here on Project Paperclip by the Nazis. And it was being implemented at Berkeley. They were brainwashing, putting people on drugs, raping people, raping children, and trying to break their minds. And so after she left Berkeley, after she was divorced from his father, her mother worked in Europe a little bit, but she also went to Canada, to McGill University, which is the hub, the MK Ultra program. So my theory is that Kamala Harris, according to Judge Joe Lewis, is an Irish Hindu woman who has lied about her heritage. She's used false pictures. They prove that the pictures were people who worked for the Harris family, and that Donald Harris, the father, was actually and he himself denies any Black heritage. He says he's Hindu and he is Irish. So you have to understand again that the Hindus, many of them from the Thuggee Society, which had murdered 2 million people in over 800-year period in India, were also in the slave trade when they were made illegal by the British government. But my personal opinion is the British government, like the mafia in the City of London, this was exposed, how the Vatican is really in business with the mob, and it's kind of similar. The City of London is in business with the Thuggee Society. And I think we talked a few weeks back about Kamala Harris, the Thuggee Society, and how her great-great-grandfather assassinated Gandhi on behalf of the British, French, and US governments. So once you tie all these people together, this is kind of the question that really got me down the aisle. And this is addressed by both Candace Owens and Joe. Why, after 700 years of being slave owners, are the descendants of the slave owners so worried about Black and poor people? Because government is another form of slavery, especially communism, which they're trying to implement. So communism is the new slavery, and they're convincing people to accept it by promising them a lot of good stuff, just like they destroyed the Black family by promising them free stuff and taking the parent out of the home in the 60s. They're doing a similar thing with communism. They're convincing everybody that it's better to have the government control everything you do, everything you say, everything you think, where you can live. This is slavery. So that's why these same groups of people who murdered, raped, tortured, and enslaved millions of Africans are now their best friend. The Democratic Party was founded to protect slavery. Slavery was a big issue in the original Constitution and Declaration of Independence. And they agreed that no more slavery would exist after a certain period of time, that you couldn't bring more people in. I forget the exact amount of years, but because the founding fathers were debating this. So since that time, the people who were in our government that were involved in the slave trade were working towards keeping slavery legal, and they actually formed the Democratic Party to preserve slavery. And so that's where we see all of these hypocrites today. Both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris always act like they're going to talk about reparations, where both of their families, including to the Irish Times and the Guardian, extensive reporting in 2015, both of their families, the Harris family, received $11 million from the British taxpayers to buy out their slaves. And they got those payments until 2015. And so did the Biden family for losing their slaves in Delaware. So these people are slavers. They've received reparations, not the slaves. The slave owners were paid out. I know for sure $11 million was paid to the Harris family. I'm still unclear as how many millions were paid to Joe Biden's family. So if anyone, I think I've said this before on your show, is thinking of suing for reparations, they should make sure to put Kamala Harris and Joe Biden on their top list because both of their families benefited for 150 years from slavery.
Well, the interesting thing is that we've been talking about reparations, and everybody scoffs at reparations. That does, it's meaningless. It shouldn't happen. I wouldn't. My parents came here, or my mom on my mom's side of the family, as indentured servants. Yeah,
Correct.
There's clear indication of that. That's slavery, and it was quite a while. The people were held in indentured, as an indentured servant. And everybody says, well, what does it mean to me today as a person that we have to be worried about whether or not we're indentured servants or whether we're slaves or paying reparations? Why is it
well, I believe they
responsibility for us? Because, but my point is that if people do know this, because a lot of people don't know what you just said, they don't know anything about the Thuggee Society. They don't know any of this stuff. This is all like fresh material. Then, to these people, and they know this, that, well, we were slaves. They got paid reparations, because they lost from the British Empire. They got even up to 2015. So why shouldn't they be entitled to?
Well, if reparations are going to occur, then why don't we get them from the people who? But that's the reason they never say they're going to do it. They always say they're going to create a panel to discuss it. And if you notice, that's right. Even what Kamala Harris recently said in her campaign. I think they make weird announcements and use strange words so they can block the algorithm. I noticed this during the time that after COVID. During the first month of COVID, people like Oprah Winfrey and Ellen DeGeneres and Tom Hanks were arrested for their crimes against humanity. And because it was covered widely and there was all kinds of clips and you could see their police record and where they were arrested. And then all of a sudden that got scrubbed. And Ellen DeGeneres comes on and she says something like, "Oh, I feel like I've been in jail." And all of the stars were saying they've been in jail. So the next day when you go to look up Ellen DeGeneres in jail, it's just the quote. So this information about reparations has been coming out through Black churches. I spend a lot of time on sites that people normally wouldn't expect me to be on. I like to screw with the algorithms too. So most frequently, they think I'm an overweight Black woman because of the things that I search on. And I screw around with the algorithms to see what the information they send me because I watch so much information. And a lot of the information that I'm originally getting is coming from people whose parents actually knew the real history of the slave trade and who they really were. And this kind of goes into my next conversation. So this is a lot of times why I have information that the average podcaster may not have, is because I'm really delving into areas that I would never probably go on in my little world.
One of the things in the world of New California is the history of the Californios. And, and there's a gap in the history books, History Channel. There's a gap in the New California history of what happened in events from 1836 to 1846. It's a deliberate gap. I mean, people can look at it now and go back and look at California history of early history on the History Channel and watch it, and it's defined. You will not see or hear of any of the history or even mention of the Californios at all, especially between 1836 and 1846. In fact, they've tried to squelch it altogether. But it's hard to find that, and you would think that if you type it in a search engine, you could find that time frame, but you can't. It's very difficult. It's very, very difficult to find it, and you have to keep plugging. It took me months actually to find the whole history, and now we've brought it out, and now all of a sudden you're starting to see some of the information appear because we're kind of shaming them into this because we're New California. But here's the other thing. All of New California is wiped out too, as a reference. You will not find New California being referenced on Wikipedia. It's just not there. And in fact, every time we put something up, because I have a Wikipedia site for New California, and I put it up, it's usually 15 minutes. It's all it takes to take it all down. And the last time I did that, it was up for 90 minutes. Wow. But so I've been trying to do this. Of course, they just are, they don't want, we've been told employees of the state of California that down, because we've done all these proclamation days and everything, the employees of state of California have been told to a person to not discuss New California state. If it comes up on your computer screen for some reason in a search, don't make any changes in your facial expression, but get it off your screen as quickly as possible.
Crazy.
So this is the burying of this, what you're talking about. There are things that they have buried history, and to search it, you have to have the proper algorithm set up.
Well, you just gave me a great segue, because guess who's been suppressing their real family history? And this is research done with the documents pulled. You can go to Candace Owens' show. You can go to Joe Brown's. They've done hours and hours. They pull all the documents. They pull all the photos. The reason Donald Harris, he doesn't even mention his father in his biography, and they give their mother a different name. And if you look at Kamala's book, they represent her as like a Black woman. But in reality, like Donald himself said, Donald Harris, he's Irish and he's Hindu, okay? His mother was Irish. And do you remember Sir Bustamante in Jamaica, the head of the Labour Party, whose primary goal was to genocide the Rastafarian people?
Yes, they do.
Her mother was one of the main supporters and financial backers of this movement. Bustamante was a young guy. He disappeared for 30 years and went to Cuba and came back a dyed-in-the-wool communist. Shortly after he returned, there started being riots in the street. He tried to form labor unions. Several hundred Rastafarians were murdered in this movement. The Rastafarians believe that they were removed, and I think you and I have discussed this. The place that they took the slaves from, the Hebrew slaves, the Ethiopian slaves off the west coast of Africa, that area had been known as the land of Judah. And the Rastafarians believe they were repeatedly displaced in the slave industry because they wanted their history to be erased and for them not to know who they are. What is the situation of most Black people today? They do not know who they are because they are the original Hebrew tribes whose identity has been captured by the Turkish Khazarians, who are the slave traders who did remove them from their homeland and put them all around the world. So the Rastafarians knew their true history. They knew who they were, and they were creating their own communities, their own farms, their own businesses. And so what did Bustamante do? Because he worked for this Khazarian communist cartel, which is to wipe out the people of Judah, to wipe out the Christian faith, the founding of communism, which most people are not aware. All of its original doctrine is to prepare the world for the rule of Satan. I lived in communist countries. This is all the original doctrine, and this is what communism continues to be today. So this man was supported by Kamala Harris. Can you imagine? It's just like Joe Biden ignored his family in India when his Indian relatives contacted him when he became president of the United States, and he ignored them because he didn't want the fact that his family founded the transatlantic slave trade 700 years ago and have that all come out. And actually, when he went to India, the president of India called him out on it, and he had to admit that his family had been in the slave trade in India for a long time. So all of this stuff is coming home to roost. And the other really interesting thing is that it's not only Kamala Harris who's lying about her background and her heritage. It's Barack Obama. Barack Obama.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I've just well, you know that he was adopted in Indonesia, and there's all these connections to Indonesia. Well, Barack Obama's mother was a high-level CIA agent. She ran the CIA operations from her bank, funding the North and South Pacific CIA operations. She married Barry Santoro. Her own mother set her up at 17 with the Barack Obama's father, who I'm not really clear on what his, but the reality is there's researchers right now, Black researchers, claiming that Barack Obama was adopted by and I forget what their I forget what their last name is right now, and Dunham, right? Her family was her and the husband. This was another CIA type arranged marriage that they adopted Barack Obama from an Arab and Egyptian couple. And if you know, you understand that Barack Obama was had strong ties to Indonesia, but that he was adopted. And on his original, when he changes his name in 1982 up in Canada, again, he changes his name in Canada. And those on his birth certificate are the two birth parents and the adoption certificate to the Dunhams. So I had several theories about this because the elite, if you look at the Bush family, when you understand who the Dunhams are, Dunham's grandfather, they're first cousins to George Bush Sr., right? And so Dunham, after she had this 2-year marriage to the Kenyan, she ends up marrying Barry Santoro. And Barry Santoro was one of the wealthiest people in the world at the time. Obama Barack did not grow up in any kind of poverty. He went to elite schools and was raised by white people. Barry Santoro was the head of the death squads in Indonesia. And he was killing all of the people in the oil areas for George Bush Sr. so he could implement the standard oil contracts that they've been trying to get in Indonesia. And they formed a company called Zapata Oil. I believe it's still in business today, but it was illegal for the United States to claim the oil in Indonesia. But as many of you know, many of the communists and the Nazis, Indonesia was very active in the Nazi party, and Hitler himself lived and died in Indonesia after he escaped Germany. So you've done a lot of coverage on that. I'll let people look into your stuff on that. But so basically both, this is my theory. There's several projects, predominantly one called Project Phoenix. And this was meant to infiltrate the Divine Nine, right? All of the schools were built by white Khazarians for Black people. And we're talking about Howard. We're talking about all the Black schools are funded by eugenicist racists. So they didn't want Black people getting out of their system. So they are trained, if you're in a Divine Nine sorority, like Kamala Harris repeatedly talks about, you are trained to be a boule. And the boule, as you and I have talked about on this show, are put in place to keep the crab barrel system in place and to keep Black people down. And we're talking pretty much every person that's in a Black leadership role. And this is why they're having such a big backlash with people like Candace Owens, because she's not a boule. So this is what's really going on in these groups. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was obsessed. He was a Khazarian put in place. His family, that's why they call it Saudi Arabia. You never read about the Saud family in the biblical text or any historic history because they're not Arabs. They're Khazarian Turks, just like the leadership of Israel and the leadership of many other countries that have been overthrown by this dark communist force. So I think that's a little bit of information. The Saudi prince was funding, and if anyone understands that The first time I ever saw Barack Obama, I actually spent a lot of time doing business with the Saudi. The Crown Prince himself made an offer on a hotel I was on the board of, so I have some direct experience with him. And the Saudi royal prince was obsessed with taking down America. And of course, he was a CIA operative, and they are working together. I was at a conference in 2010. I went to, and I saw the Greater Israel, Greater Saudi land map that they were showing at a conference that was in Mayfair in London. I was flown over there to meet with the board of directors of the uranium company I was working for at the time. And they happened to put me in this hotel. I don't know why they decided. Mayfair is basically predominantly Muslim now, but it was close to their offices. So I literally walked through their presentation room and saw the Greater Israel, Greater Saudi. That's why they've been killing all the people in the countries between those, because those two people pretend, those two groups of satanic bloodline families pretend that they're enemies, but they're working together to create the Levant that they lost back when the tribes separated, a few thousand years ago. ISIL is Levant, right? Israel, Iran, Iraq. Yeah, they stand for the countries they plan on taking over.
Yeah, well, in fact, the situation that developed with Barack Obama is that he ultimately called it ISIL. And, when he was talking about ISIS, and he gave the name back to that whole area of what Levant was. And he kept on referring to the ISIS as the ISIL and the Levant. And people couldn't quite figure that one out. And we told them on the air what was going on. It was something that's an ancient land, basically, and he's reviving it. And people just, they wiped out.
That's exactly what their greater plan is.
Right, but the terminology and him using it in State Department memos, whatever, he enshrined it as the land and just eliminated the country of Israel, basically. People technically.
Well, and yes, there's warring factions between those groups.
Right.
They on the surface, there's warring factions between these groups, but they descend from the exact same people. So just like they turned the English against the Germans, they're turning the Israelis against the Saudis, and their plan is to come in and take everything over. If Barack Obama and John McCain financed both ISIS and ISIL. So if you notice, as soon as Trump came in, they were wiped out because their money was stopped. And basically what occurred during ISIS and ISIL is they killed all of the Christians that still lived in the Middle East. If you notice, none of those countries have any Christians anymore, right? Because both the Muslim faith and the Catholic faith have been spread by the power of the sword, convert or be murdered. And this has been going on for a long time. We had the Dark Ages in Europe, the reason many of our families left in the first place, the reason nobody wanted Catholic presidents, because they understand. As a Catholic, and most Catholics don't understand this even, but Catholics worship the Pope as God on earth, and he believes that he controls and owns the entire planet. And people say they don't do that, but if you're a Catholic, that's your religion. That is what you're doing. You may not be aware of it, but that's what you're doing. And I have a lot of Catholic friends. I've talked about this before. I'm talking about the political Vatican structure that's controlled the planet for 3,000 years via the Roman birth certificate system.
The evidence is there. The Holy Roman Empire, the First Reich, Second Reich, Third Reich, now the Fourth Reich, two of them driven by Adolf Hitler. And again, that's all related to the Catholic Church. The exfil of all German soldiers and anybody in the Nazi Party out of Germany was a spectacular success because of the Catholic Church. And in fact, it wasn't until people like Peter Levenda stepped up and really exposed all that with his book called The Rat Line. And of course, that also exposed Adolf Hitler. They found where he was, which was Sarajevo in Indonesia. He found that they died there. He died there in 1970, which goes to the point of what you're talking about. Is Barry Santoro's stepfather really was who he was. We did a special piece on Barry Santoro and the whole thing about his Subud friends. And I'm sure you've heard of the Subuds before because he was also a Subud. But he was a stone cold killer. And as you say, he was a murderer in Indonesia. He ran murder rings and things like that. Speak about that.
Okay, so I worked in Jakarta a few years. I was probably there for a while in 2009 or 2010. And there is the prison where Jojo Santoro and the death squads, people in Indonesia still walk around that prison. And they say you can still hear screaming and torture. Like it's a huge thing. Like anyone, the taxi drivers won't go up to it. It's still known. I mean, Indonesia is still known as a brutal dictatorship, and people are still tortured and withheld there.
Well, that's so with Barry Santoro. If you insult somebody and you're even not from that country, they'll like whip you with canes. You know, they'll torture you that way. Cane.
Well, you know what? Other people in other countries just don't believe that, here in America, people are afraid to say anything about anything these days. But in other countries where these systems really are implemented, that they're trying to implement on us, Americans just don't comprehend. It's super hard unless you've been to these other places and you've heard the stories predominantly, mainly of older people, because they're the ones who experienced the World War II atrocities and what happened after World War II. But both World War I and World War II were fought so the city of London could take control of the oil and mineral reserves of the planet. I personally believe we're seeing right now what's occurring is the end of World War I. I don't believe the two wars ever ended. The Allied troops starved 10 million people in Germany between World War I and World War II. So we don't really know what happened in the wars. The leaders of our country are all eugenicists, meaning they believe that a large percent of us need to die to preserve the world. And I'm talking Kamala Harris is one, Barack Obama is one, and they've been hired to pretend to be parts of these minority groups so they can infiltrate and try to keep them in the slave system. When they were losing people of color, they decided, it's time to put somebody in. But Barry Santoro is the nephew of George Bush Sr. Sarah Palin is also his cousin and a niece of George Bush Sr. Dick Cheney is related to George Bush Sr. These people practice Kabbalah. They're into group sex. They're into the abominations. And pedophilia is the reason we're seeing so much pedophilia is because the people in control of our planet right now are pedophiles themselves. Yeah. And we can see this. The head of Abercrombie and Fitch just got arrested. And apparently his network makes Jeffrey Epstein's look like child's.
Yeah, I was going to say, they've been around forever doing what they've been doing.
Like a lot of people do.
Yeah.
The guy, Jean-Luc Brunel, was also from the reason these families are wealthy is because their families were receiving reparations from the slave trade. The French were heavily involved in the slave trade. I bet I've never had a chance to look this up, but I bet the French people have been paying off all of the French slave owners just like the British were, because the French and the British are at war with each other all the time, but their leaders have constantly intermarried for 1,000 years. So they're all related. So the Jean-Luc Brunel, it kind of ties in. We're seeing Abercrombie and Fitch. We're seeing all these elite. And I told one of my friends about 6 or 7 years ago when I noticed a lot of the big corporations were starting to get in trouble. And I couldn't understand their rapid expansion. Like for instance, McDonald's is is a real estate company, really. They sell franchises, but they really acquire real estate. And I saw all these Walmarts going in, and there's just so many. I mean, we used to need one for a whole town. Now we have 15. My personal belief is the ill-gotten gains of the drug trade, the human trafficking, the organ harvesting, of all the illegal activities that are going on our military bases worldwide, that some of these companies were really just laundering the money. And I believe that more than all today, as we see different corporations going bankrupt and broke. And so I just had an interesting tidbit. Do you know that Kamala Harris is related to Jussie Smollett? Do you remember Jussie Smollett, the guy who accused?
I remember him, yeah.
What we're finding out about the Smollett situation, and Cory Booker and Kamala Harris were both in Chicago the day of this attack. What Judge Joe Brown has commented and read all the documents relating to this case. This was legislation that was brought in. They tried to pass it in the 1990s. The Black Caucus, according to Judge Joe Brown, is basically an LGBTQ front. And most of the work they're doing is to promote LGBT. And of course, Cory Booker himself is gay. And as we found out through the P. Diddy, most from the preachers to the actors to the rap artists and the politicians are predominantly homosexuals. So it starts to make sense. The ones in our public eye, not every single one, of course. I want to clarify that. But what he said is this was really, it's not a non-lynching legislation. It's actually, it's to make trans people in a specific class, like you have hate crimes and you have that. Well, for instance, it's not mob lynching. It's not anything. So if he used the example, if you're out in a club and you start dancing with a girl and you start making out with her and then you find out she's a guy and you punch her, you would be entitled, you would fall under the lynching crime and you would have a stiffer penalty for that. So have you heard anything about that?
No, but what I do believe, and we're going to have to wrap it up here, but what I do believe is that the part about how much wealth has been acquired by trafficking in drugs in particular. Yes. Really trafficking is just they've come out with it now and they want to try and out it as a norm, that it's normal to do trafficking. It's normal to have sex with children. It's normal to have child sex trafficking. It's normal to do these things. And then, their children are dispensable or expendable. They can be.
Well, you've got Tim Walz that believes babies should be expendable like after birth, and we literally had Nancy Pelosi that wouldn't consent, wouldn't argue when people were saying, "Well, we understand that you're putting forward legislation that babies up to a year old are disposable because these people practice child sacrifice. So they're trying to create laws that are protecting them." Why do you think there was a big move
to make it acceptable
of all this trans stuff being crammed down our throat? Because they're trying to recruit people before we find out that the royal families of Europe have been gender inverting their children forever. And that our Hollywood movie stars and sports actors, these people we idolize, are gender inverting their children. So on that note of the expulsion, so I'm going to say one thing on behalf of Kamala Harris. She didn't attend the Catholic dinner, and I support her on that. Okay? Because you know why? Because the day of the Catholic dinner, the Archdiocese of Los Angeles was ordered to pay $880 million in pedophilia cases. And just that diocese alone has spent over $780,000. And there's a new article saying that was the offer the church made for $880 million. It's really going to turn out to be $1.5 billion. So all of you people who donated the $10 million to the Catholic Association, I find it very interesting that they had the event the same night that this news would have hit it. Yeah. And they have raised and they have killed so many children. People need to wake up. And I'm sorry to leave it on a negative note like that.
No, this is the stuff that we have to put out there, Simone, and how evil this truly is. Well, tell us how we can get a hold of you.
Sorry, I'm getting a little agitated, but this stuff really bugs me.
But tell us how we can get in touch with you and watch your information quickly.
Okay, well, what's coming up is I have a great interview about getting community active in your community. It's a call to action. It's going to come out Wednesday on my Lost in Translation show, One Word, and it's with some of the ladies from the New California movement. So I think you guys will enjoy hearing about their experiences and our call to action, because the real target is our children. And keep that in mind. No matter Simone, what they're trying to convince you of, the target is our children. And a lot of money that you're donating to your church and to your other activities is going to pay off pedophilia cases. So next time you decide whether you're donating money or not, please think about that.
Awesome. Simone Anderson. Simone Anderson with us here on Agenda 21 Radio. Thank you very much, Simone. We have to run for time.